Preserving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string.
Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots. It's Tuesday morning, and we have today a very, very good program scheduled, and I want to thank some people that have been really helpful with our fundraising effort. We are getting there. We've got a long ways to go, but we are getting there thanks to a few people who have been very, very generous. I also need to pay the bills this morning by talking a little bit about a couple of the shows that are coming up. Jeff Bennett follows my radio show today. Jeff has been on a hiatus for a few months, and he's coming back with his show, Life, Liberty, and All That Jazz, and that's coming on right after my program. Also, I want to mention that Debbie Boscalupi's program, Radioactive Wednesday, is on the same time as my program, only on Wednesday. And Debbie's got a terrific couple of guests coming on tomorrow, personal friend Jim Beers, as well as a young man who is an 8th grader who has been speaking out in class about some of the things that are wrong with this country and his interesting story. So I also want to mention that we do have that Ramsey FM 100B transmitter giveaway going, and we really need to get people sign up for that, and also sign up for the all the programs that we're doing as far as T-shirts and all that stuff. We need your help in getting some of these programs going, and this is a good way to do it. You get something for your money. Okay, with that, I want to introduce our guest for today. I've got two guests on. Tom Ertl, who is a home builder in Tallahassee, Florida, and he is a member of a local Presbyterian church. For over 3 decades, he's worked with various Christian and political organizations, including Freedom Council in the 80s. He's a former member of the Council for National Policy and has sat on various Christian ministry and political boards. He is also a publisher of Christian historical and theological works and is a columnist for News with Views. And that's where I first ran into Tom, was on his News with Views articles, really terrific articles. Our other guest that's on with us this morning is coming back, he was on my radio program on Thursday night. We ran into a few glitches with telephones, but he is back today because we had such a terrific show. I wanted to introduce him to the listeners on the micro effect. And that gentleman is Reverend Matthew Cummings, and Reverend Cummings is pastor of a church in northern Washington, a town called Colville, and then he's got a very interesting story because he's been involved with I'll let him tell you his story. Matthew, are you on the call?
He is not.
Oh, he is not. Okay.
Not yet, no.
All right. Is Tom Ertl on the call?
Well, I think we have Pastor Cummings on line one.
Okay, good. All right. Pastor Cummings, are you on the call?
Yes, I am.
Oh, good. All right, I'm going to start with you. I don't think Tom is on the call yet, but I'm going to start with you because you've got a terrific story, and I want you to kind of fill our listeners in on the let's just have you tell your story about your childhood and about your experiences in the Detroit school system as a very young child. And then we'll move into further discussion about some of the things that are going on between church and state in our country.
Sure. In 1969, I was recruited from the University of Michigan for a special school by a woman named Diane Oughton, who was very left of center and had an interest to reach into minority communities and to pick out young black boys and girls that they could shape and mold in a certain way of thinking. And that school was called Children's Community School. I happened to be 7 at the time, and the principal of that school was none other than Bill Ayers, the leader of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, the founder of that, and also the leader of the Weatherman Underground. And so upon being recruited, going through a half-hour question from Diane Oughton, which was in the summer, that fall, the first day of class was to be one that would not emulate. In fact, most of the public schools today take its cue from that time in 1969, because the first day of class when I was there, Diane Oughton, upon having about 35 kids, basically said, when we were there, you no longer have to listen to your parents, and began to teach socialist and communist ways of thinking to us. And, of course, being 7 and impressionable, hearing the idea that I didn't have to listen to my mom, of course, as a young boy, rambunctious, was like, yeah, all right. But the main issue was that there was a challenge even then. They were looking to challenge parents' rights, and that actually, for me and for those that were there, we were being told that we were actually wards of the state, not literally wards of our parents. And so that I proceeded to go home from that first day of class and share what Diane Oughton had said and what the school was teaching. And my mother, of course, looked over at on the wall for the belt, which I understood I needed it. And then by inspiration of God, grabbed a pen and paper and said, what else did Diane tell you? What else is the school saying? And so the next 4 months, every time I came home, I shared all that, what was being taught to me. And my mom, upon getting the information and also calling other parents, realized that all of us were being indoctrinated in socialist and communist ways of thinking. And so eventually they had meetings with the leadership and Bill Ayers and could not agree. And so I got pulled out after 4 or 5 months of such an experiment. And so a lot of what was said in those 4 or 5 months are resonating so much in our society today. It was considered open classroom, which truly broke down the idea of people being individual and achieving and competition, and actually that us kids would work together. So when I see how things are now, I'm even more disturbed realizing that it started back in the late 60s. Diane Orton herself, who was truly gifted to teach, but was deceived politically and spiritually, ended up becoming not just a teacher, was not just part of SDS, but she was one of the bomb makers for the Weatherman Underground, and died in the famous Greenwich Village bombing in 1970. One of her own bombs actually went off while she was making it. And so anyway, that's just it. Just wanted to share that a little bit, and that, there are so many things that can be discussed. One of the main things was the idea that we were no longer our parents, but we're actually wards of the state.
Right, and that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today, Matthew, is the fact that the whole school system has been changed, and the changes resulted as of those experiments that people like Bill Ayers were doing in the late 60s, early 70s, and now, certainly under Barack Obama, they became leaders of the school reform movement and part of this Common Core push. And, of course, I think most of us that are involved with the school system in any way recognizes that Common Core is, at the very least, it's a progressive socialist system, and at the very most, it outright teaches communism.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a good overview of your youth. When your mom got together with the other parents on this thing, what were some of the responses by the other parents? Were they doing? Were they having the same kind of heartburn?
Yes, actually they were. In fact, my mom was surprised that actually things had not been done sooner by others. Because as all of us went home, boys and girls, of course, we right away shared with our parents what was the topic of the day, what we were being taught. And as my mom would tell you, some heard it and thought that, of course, their boys and girls were fibbing. But then when it came every day, they were coming back saying they realized that, yes, indeed, something's dreadfully wrong at children's community school. And so, there was first disbelief, and then the realization that, that this school was teaching everything contrary to, our American way of life.
Right.
Right. And I heard that there's no God. I heard that the American government was not good but bad. I heard that the only individualism that we're to have is that we're to work together for what I now realize is socialist and progressive ideas, to focus even more on being a person of color, minority, and of course, during that time, the Vietnam War was in high gear in protests, and so that was the other part, that America was truly imperialistic, and that, that America had blood on its hands. So.
Well, I am not surprised that Bill Ayers, really became, let's say, Barack Obama's mentor. You're familiar with a lot of the connections there between Bill Ayers and Barack Obama. Would you maybe just tell our listeners some of the things? I know that he's been credited, Bill Ayers has been credited as a ghostwriter for both of Obama's books about his father and his youth. Tell our listeners from your perspective how that connection works.
Well, many people, of course, in this station are probably very informed, so I'll just try to repeat what I might know or do know. Number one, in regards to ghostwriter, that there would be a certain narrative that was written, and that everything that Bill, which did actually write that book, everything that was written was to slant the narrative of imperialism, even in regard to Obama's father's coming from Kenya, and the idea that Kenya was subjected, that's the key word that they'll say, subjected to European ways of thinking and idea, subjected to not just in government, but in regard to that Jesus was a white God. And, Bill Ayers did stress that, and Barack Obama did put that across in regard to why America is not a Christian nation, because he himself, although there was pretend, is not a Christian. He never was. So, it's written throughout the book about how he saw his father, how he emulated him, his struggle against imperialism, against white oppression of black Africans, and that people forget that Barry, which was his real name, Barry didn't change his name until he got to college.
Right.
And once he got out of high school in Hawaii, he changed his name to Barack after having did some studies on his father's side of the family, which was from Kenya, and so Barack Hussein. So with that, it's quite disturbing, in my view, to see the undertones of Bill Ayers' writings in the book, in both books that Barack Obama had claimed to write, but we knew it was Bill Ayers itself.
Right, right. Well, so the thing that I see too, Matthew, is, and this is why we've got this program today with Tom Ertl and yourself, is because we see changes in our whole culture, in our whole society, and they're literally attacking every institution that has made America great, that has made America exceptional, and has made America free. And, it goes into all the different isms, socialism, racism, sexism, feminism,
That's right.
you name it, and that's one of the reasons that Tom is on the call. Tom, are you on the call this morning with us?
Yep.
Oh, good. We got you on. I did introduce you a little bit earlier to our audience, but Tom, I want you to talk a little bit about your some of the writing you've done for News with Views and different publications. And I didn't mention this because I kind of wanted you to mention it, but you are a publisher as well as being a custom home builder and writer and other things. You're also a publisher of a group called Zurich Publishing, and you're doing books on religion. I've got one on my desk right here that you sent me. Very interesting read. The New Day of Small Beginnings, and it's about the Reformation movement in the church. And it was written by a gentleman who I guess died a few years ago, but a gentleman who was French, and he saw the fall of the church in Europe and in France because of a lack of centering and a lack of focus on the Bible, and how religion really has become kind of I guess I would call it rather than being Bible-based, it's secular humanist-based. Tom, welcome to the program, and please tell our listeners a little bit about your article that I read just recently on feminism, and let's start talking about the subject of feminism and how that has really hurt the American family.
Well, Dan, first of all, great to be on your show, and Pastor Cummings, great to be with you, too. When you mentioned a little of my background, what's interesting is I, for the last couple of years, wrote articles, tried to on a monthly basis with News with Views with Paul Walters out of Oregon, great political site, very conservative, and did a lot of stuff pro-Trump, got on the Trump bandwagon early and still am, a little dismayed with the neocon bombings over there, bombing the earth to death here of late. But anyways, wrote articles, a lot of them on Trump to support him, and what's interesting is that when you, as a Christian, when you write political articles, there's always a little bit of a gap there, and I try to spin my conclusions with the religious influence. The article that you just mentioned that I just wrote with News with Views, and it was picked up on Russian Space Site and other sites, it was called Birthrates and the Future of Western Christianity, and it was a cultural article. And the reason when you write political articles, you always, there's a gap of effectiveness there, because we know the role of civil government biblically is a limited role, that there's only so much you can do politically. And what always trumps politics is culture. And as one of the Van Til said, culture is religion externalized. So the elements of culture are much more important than politics. In this one article, I really hit on an important realm of culture, and that is birth rates in the West and the decline of it, and what that means to Western civilization, Western society, all of our traditions that we've had for 2,000 years of Christianity, the influence of the age of faith in Christendom. All of that is now being jeopardized because of birth rates. So, and then the subtitle, which was kind of interesting, was "Where Have All the Grandchildren Gone?" So I started the article out with a story of a friend of mine in northwest Iowa who was out to dinner one night, and he overheard two women talking, and you can read it in the article. And the older women were discussing, one of them was discussing family and their children, and two grandchildren that she had, and how delighted she was. And the other one, so the one that had the grandchildren asked the other one, "How many do you have?" And she says, "Well, I don't have any, and I don't think I'm ever going to get any." grandchildren with my 2 kids. And my friend said, a Christian friend said, it was one of the saddest comments he's heard in years of this woman lamenting the fact that she was never going to have any grandchildren. And my friend has got 22, and his comment in the article I quoted him was, he felt like telling the one lady, listen, I've got 22 grandkids, I'd be glad to borrow one of them to you over the weekend here for a weekend. So I just went through the article on why we have a decline in the birth rate in the West and what was behind it. So obviously feminism was a main tenet, probably the main engine to drive that anti-baby train to where we are now.
Right. Well, and I know right now globalism, multiculturalism, all the terms that they use to promote one world global government that's basically a combination of feudalism and Marxism. But the whole basis for that movement, that drive, is to reduce the world's population to fewer than 1 billion people. Now, the so-called think tanks, the really smart people, and I say that very laughingly, that have come up with these harebrained plans, have said that, you know, we need to reduce the world's population to fewer than 1 billion people. The problem that we have obviously with that is that the developed Western cultures are not the ones, they're the ones reducing population, but all the undeveloped and all the other cultures around the world are increasing population. And we're losing our Christian culture. It's basically because we've allowed our cultural values, our social values, and our religious values to atrophy to the point where we're almost a non-entity now. What do you think about that?
Well, you're absolutely right, Dan. I'm looking in preparation for our interview, looking at these. A secretary pulled up the birth rate in America, and it was worse than I thought. I mean, so there's a chart here on the birth rates where total fertility rate per adult woman. Okay, in the year 1800, right? 1800, America, very Christian. Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in 1828, wrote his book in 1832, Democracy in America. So at that period of time, there was 7.04 kids per adult woman. Okay, then you go to 1900, it can cut in half, 3.56. Then obviously with World War II, with the men gone, it hit a low level of 2.22. And then we have the baby boom generation. Thank goodness for that, because I was born in that era, probably you two also. And you see in 1950, per woman, 2.98, and then in 1960, at the high point, in the last 70 years, was 3.53. And then it started declining. And it was then in 1970, 2.39 child per woman. 1980, a low point, 1.77, and now it's in the year 2000, it's gone up to 2.05. But I think you need 2.1 child per woman to keep the base population rate from going negative. So what's interesting when you look at this chart, if you didn't know any modern history, you'd say, okay, why is it that it's a radical decline in 1970 to a low point in 1980? What was going on in culture? Well, it's feminism. And you talk about what are the effects of feminism? Well, the effects of feminism were to get, as you would say, you know, the ruling elites, our ruling class. You know, you also have to talk about the bankers and the multinational corporations that really are our masters of the universe. They always were for negative population growth, and feminism was a way to get the mothers out of the home, into the workforce, raise more taxes, and two things. They knew if they get the moms out of the home, there'd be less children born, and then the kids would have to come into the public school system at an earlier age and be in control of the state. So it really was, feminism was a movement really more by, you could say, international bankers, corporate heads, Rockefeller Foundation, Ford Foundation, more than it was really an organic women's movement.
Right. Well, and I have to say, everything that's been happening over the last 100+ years is Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously said, "Nothing in government happens by accident." Yeah, and we've been used by a system that is intent on not only reducing population, but also driving us to a world government, and that's been going on for a very long time. I want to get Matthew back into the discussion here because, and I want you gentlemen to get to know one another. This is, I guess, an introduction. And, we're going to have to pick this up on the other side of the break, gentlemen. Stay online, and we will be back right after the break.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the Republic.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today we're going to be connecting a lot of dots with the changes in our society and the de-Christianization of America and the Western world, and how that's impacting families, our society. Everything about our culture is changing as a result of attacks on the family and on Christianity. And before we get back into the discussion, I want to tell our listeners we're rebuilding my danhappel.com website, and we're in the process of making some major changes to that site that make it really easy for people to get on that site and access archived radio shows. We're working very hard to get everything up, and we are adding a lot of features to that site. And one of the things I want to tell our listeners to please do is go to that site, danhappel.com, and there is a free movie available from the 19th to the 28th. It's called Revelation. It's produced and directed by Chuck and Anita Undersea, and it's about globalism, and it's about the destruction of our culture. And it's a free movie, and I like to get our listeners to go to that site, to the danhappel.com site, and there it's very easy to click on and sign up for that free movie through my site. Also, on my site, I want to mention that we do have a program going right now, and it's a promotion on our Red Pill Expo that's coming up in Spokane on the 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of June. And go to my site, danhappel.com, and you can buy tickets at a 15% discount on that site. So please go to that site and purchase tickets through that site, and you'll save 15%, and you will be involved in one of the greatest yearly programs in the freedom movement. It's probably going to be the event of the year. Frankly, I don't see anybody that's going to even come close. And so please go to that site and click on and buy tickets to the Red Pill Expo. And then also later today, after my show, please listen for Jeff Bennett's program. He is doing a program that's called Life, Liberty, and All That Jazz, and he's been on a hiatus, but he's coming back today. So listen to that program and listen to Debbie Boscalupi's program, Radioactive Wednesday, tomorrow morning from 8 till 10 a.m. Pacific time. So, okay, with that, I'm sorry, guys. I didn't mean to do too much preaching here, but we've got to pay the bills. Matthew, I wanted to get you back on, and I wanted kind of to introduce you two gentlemen because I know that you have so much in common, and you are trying to do the same things, and that's to make America aware of the attacks on our culture and on our Christian base, and they're trying to destroy all the fundamental things that have made America great. So, Matthew, come back on and talk about your experiences in the Detroit school system. One of the things that came out of that is that Bill Ayers was having an affair with the lady who was your teacher, and he was also having an affair with a number of other women, and he talked her into, she became a bomb maker for the Weather Underground, correct?
Yes. In fact, Diane Oughton, whom, there are books that are written about her, but she actually was a good friend of my mother's, so we know a little bit more than just what's been written about the situation. That's why I can talk about it. Diane Oughton had been, of course, Bill Ayers, or what she was hoping, the only lover, and she was under the impression that, of course, he would marry her. And actually, my mom doesn't mention much about it because, she likes to keep her privacy, but had spoken confidence to my mother, who always talked to Diane about the Lord, that Bill was not really what I would call faithful as she had thought. And so Diane was encouraged very much to be more involved, not just with SDS, but of course with become one of what's called the Weatherman Underground, and even more to work in building bombs for that organization against federal installations. So when I kind of think about that and look back at it, the trail was all around. And the woman that he's married to now, Bill Ayers, was one of 4 women. Diane was one of the 4 women that Bill Ayers was messing with.
Wow.
So.
Yeah, well, that's indicative. And incidentally, Diane Oughton, she ended up basically blowing herself up and killing herself while she was trying to make bombs for the Weather Underground. That was your school teacher.
That's right. Right.
That is absolutely astounding story, and I know Tom is going to have a great time getting to know you, because one of the things that he's talking about is feminism, and one of the things that you and I have talked about is racism. There's all kinds of isms that the progressive socialists are trying to use to divide and conquer our society and to destroy the Christian base. And, they've created one ism after another, and they claim, like Barack Obama claimed that he was going to unify America. There was more divisiveness and more, racial identification and sexual and everything else as a result of his presidency. We've got a lot more conflict than we ever had before, and that's one of the things that we're all worried about. Tom, your conversation about feminism. Let's talk. You've done a lot of work on that. I'd like you to talk a bit about the origins, the promoters of it, who funded the movement. I know you started to mention some of the people, but what exactly has it done for women, and maybe the present state of feminism?
Well, good multiple question there. Let's probably start with the origins of it. So feminism, they say it's in four waves. The first wave, 1800s, mid-late, to the women's suffrage movement in the 1920s in America and earlier progressive era. And then you have the second wave in the 1960s, 70s, which was what we're going to really talk about more. Third wave was, and fourth, more radicalized feminism that came later. So the second wave, key date in the second wave of feminism was 1963, when Betty Friedan wrote her fabulously famous bestseller book called The Feminine Mystique. And, you had in the 60s, women that started a little later, maybe in the later 60s, started the National Organization of Women, which was Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, and Bella Abzug. Bella Abzug, the politician. There are basically three New York Jewish women that started that movement in the feminist movement in America. The fourth one that's really key, that a lot of people don't talk about, is the French woman Simone de Beauvoir. Have you heard of her at all? If you haven't, she is the decades-long lover of Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous French philosopher in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so here, let's look at the origins of these three American women, and actually Beauvoir too. So Betty Friedan, and this is really interesting when you study these women, the women's histories there, because they all came from dysfunctional families. Betty Friedan, her maiden name was Betty Naomi Goldstein, born in I think 1927 in Peoria, Illinois. Married Carl Friedan in 1947, had 3 kids, hated her home life. They were physically abusive to each other, both the husband and wife there, Betty and Carl. She hated her mother. She hated being a mother herself, and it was a very difficult situation for her to be at home raising children. All right, so that's her history. And then you have, what's interesting is Gloria Steinem. Gloria Steinem, another dysfunctional woman, was born in Toledo, Ohio, and her mother and father divorced when she was 11. Her mother was in and out of sanatoriums, having mental problems and mental breakdowns and all that. Gloria Steinem ended up as a mid-teen working in bars and nightclubs, and some of the biographers were talking about her really teenage prostitution. She left Toledo, went to live with her sister in Washington, and later went to, I think, Smith College, and ended up coming to New York. When she came to New York, she became a Playboy bunny. She was extremely good-looking in her younger days, and probably made a very good bunny, but it's kind of odd that leading a woman in the feminist movement was a Playboy bunny. And what's interesting on her background is that she, in I think 1958, she became a CIA asset. Now, all of her life, she was involved with the CIA. In fact, some of the biographers say that everything she's done throughout all of her adult life was under the direction of the CIA. The CIA helped fund her, and so that's a whole other issue there on why the CIA was involved with her life in promoting feminism, and who the CIA is controlled by. So you have her, then later in the 70s, starting Ms. Magazine, and her patron was, I think, a guy named Carl Felker at New York, the New Yorker magazine, and he put Gloria Steinem magazine, the new one, the new Ms. Magazine, in his, and it was tremendously successful. And then she became very well known in the movement. Okay, the third one that we talked about before was Simone de Beauvoir, and she wrote the famous book, I think it was called The Second Sex, radical feminist. So here we have, she was tied as the lover and decades-long lover of Jean-Paul Sartre, leading philosopher in France, and they had a live-in situation. Obviously, if you're a humanist philosopher, you can't have a covenant and marry. That's too Christian, so we can't do that. So they lived together. And the strange thing in their relationship is she was an educator, very smart. Sartre relied on her for a lot of his research and checked really everything he did. Ran through Simone de Beauvoir, a beautiful woman. And she had a troubled childhood. Her father said that he spoiled her, and very issues there. And what's interesting, there's one story, and I'll end with this, is that she was an educator in Paris, and she brought home two Russian girls, beautiful Russian girls, Olga and Wanda, if I remember their names. And Jean-Paul Sartre, her live-in boyfriend, the philosopher, spent his efforts trying to seduce both of these young students, and he was successful with Wanda. And then Wanda, after the event, ended up going and hunting up Beauvoir and told her about it. She was very upset and the whole thing. So when you look at all these three women, these are the main philosophers of that second wave feminism: Friedan, Steinem, and Simone de Beauvoir, from dysfunctional families. You look at Beauvoir and Sartre and their life, and you think of Dostoevsky's famous comment, "Without God, anything is permissible." And so these were the women that told other women in America and in the West to get a new identity, to leave their home, and to take on a new worldview that was different than how women view themselves for 7,000 years of recorded history. And they were tremendously successful. And we talked about the birth rates earlier and how they were able to get the women out of the home, and they changed the way women thought of themselves. And it's just, I wrote in my article, I said, I don't know if we've ever had a social movement that had such fantastic success as feminism. Now, 55 years later, however it's been, we can look back and see the results of feminism, and it's not too good on women.
Yes, exactly, and one of the things that came out of the feminist movement, and you made a allusion to it with Gloria Steinem's connections with the CIA, is that in the mid-'60s, under President Johnson, we got Great Society programs, and we literally were buying guns and butter at the same time. And I don't know if all of our listeners know this, I'm sure some do, but they started to dip into the Social Security Trust Fund to fund all these programs, to fund all the social programs as well as the war in Vietnam. And they realized that they're going to run out of money pretty fast. And I've read a number of things, Tom, that say that the CIA and different groups decided that the one way that we could maybe forestall some of that would be to get more people in the workforce and get both husbands and wives working and paying taxes. And that's exactly what happened for a while, and now we've been running deficits, for 40 years. And as a result, we've got a huge national deficit and unfunded liabilities coming out to years. And now we've got fewer taxpayers to pay for it because we sent all of our jobs overseas. I mean, this whole feminist movement, if anybody ever thought that there were a bunch of really smart people that were pushing all these isms because they were going to make America a better, greater place, they are dead wrong. Am I right?
No, you're totally right. And when you talked about it earlier, the effects of socialism and all the isms, and listen, you have economic socialism, the destruction of our economy that was planned by our, masters of the universe, and the destruction of the family through feminism. We talk about the continual wars, and you mentioned even the artificial conflicts between people groups within the United States, between black and white, Hispanics, all that. All that's artificially built to destroy the Christian order. And I tell you what, Dan, I don't, you can talk about the economic thing, and you can talk about the racial and the wars. I think much more destructive than that was what feminism did to the family. And here, let me give you some quotes. These, for your younger listeners that are, that are not as old as me, that did not go through the feminist movement in the 60s and the consequences in the 70s, 80s, they have no idea the radicalism that came out of it. There's just some quotes from early feminists. And Robin Morgan, here's her comment. "We can't destroy the inequities between men and women until we destroy marriage." She called marriage a slavery-like practice. This is how radical these people were. Mary Jo Bain, "In order to raise children with equality, you must take them away from families and communally raise them." Sounds a little Marxist, doesn't it? Then Vivian Gornick, "Being a housewife is an illegitimate profession." Helen Sullinger, "We must work to destroy marriage. The end of the institution of marriage is the necessary condition for the liberation of women." And of course, our favorite, Gloria Steinem, quote, we don't just want to destroy capitalism, we need to tear down the whole effing patriarchy. Mm-hmm. So these were the thoughts and the quotes in the books, in the Phil Donahue shows, if you remember that, in all the interviews, all the magazines that had barraged women in the early 60s through the 70s to get them to become something different than they were for 7,000 years of history. And what it did, so you talk about all the isms, and I'm telling you, feminism was much more harmful than I think all the other ones. And it took that delicate fundamental relationship between a man and a woman and created a war between the sexes, a artificial conflict of woman against man, woman feeling like she's been abused. And here's the thing, Dan, you can't take the gender roles and turn them upside down and have a healthy, functioning society. It will not work. So now we have what we have. We have decreased population, which has huge ramifications on every realm of societal life, and we have disruption of functioning families, functioning children, mature children, huge ramifications all across the board because of the effects of feminism and also really because the church, I put this in the article, did not stop it. They did not resist it like they should have. And they could have stopped feminism and that whole erroneous philosophy, but they didn't. They just laid down and let it run its course. So we have what we have.
Yeah. Well, and that certainly is something that Matthew will really weigh in on because we've had that very discussion. Matthew and I have had that discussion about how the church has failed to do the right thing. They're so concerned about keeping their tax-exempt status and being warm and fuzzy and non-political and getting along with everyone and, trying to be the best of everything except Bible-based. And so in the process of doing that, they've pretty much nullified themselves from the whole process and made themselves inconsequential. Matthew, weigh in on that, would you please?
Well, I was listening to all. Hey, Tom. First off, loving everything you're saying. Praise the Lord. Listening to all that's been said and just thinking in regard to how much ground the church lost in the 60s and 60s, 70s, 80s, and how certain ways of certain mindsets were allowed to be put in place to basically put the mute button on pastors, not just speaking the truth, but standing for the truth no matter what it's going to cost. And yes, a good part of that is the 501c3, and by the way, that did come during Johnson's administration, and he was as a senator, as you know, was the one that got that voted in to see to it that ministers and churches, which it's kind of funny, but we all know, those of us who are true people of the Republic, that the Constitution already gives us enough rights as Bible-believing Christians. But the idea to be given a tax-exempt status, and how the church did not recognize what was being done, that they were being put in a slavery type mentality with the idea of the mute button being put there, it was so subversive, and yet God's people, even those who were involved in politics during that time, did not realize what would be the full extent of it. And so it became full circle for me on all this when I felt led, before Barack Obama became president, had to come back home from Europe and start trying to wake up God's people of who he was, what he was about, and why Christians needed to not be quiet but begin to speak up. That ministry, I'm sorry about going around this, Dan, I just want to get this in. As I went around and preached around America, because I'd already been ministering overseas, I found that God's pastors all over were really afraid to stand up and speak. And that's black churches, white churches, mixed. It doesn't matter. You know, it was all across this great nation of ours, this great republic of ours. And so it dawned on me, as it has with many others, that, you know, we've allowed, I'll just say it, the left and the world to evangelize the church.
Yeah.
To basically,
absolutely.
What
it really boils down to is we need a new black robe regiment in our churches. And the people that are in our audience, I'm sure most recognize that term, the Black Robe Regiment from the Revolutionary War. Most of the pastors in the churches were actually the leaders of the freedom movement. They were, many of them, leaders of the militias. And during that time, black ministers were very much involved in that Black Robe Regiment as well.
Hey, Dan, can I cut in here?
Sorry.
Oh, sure. Tom, go ahead. Say what you want.
Pastor Matt, let me make a comment off of what you said. I thought it was very profound that the culture in the world has evangelized the church. And here's and going back to feminism and the lower birth rates and all that, here's what happens when the preachers don't preach the whole counsel of God. And this, let me go back a little in my article. Pastor, I put in the article, I said, when have you ever heard, to the reader, a sermon, a three-part sermon series on feminism, and exposing feminism, what it is, the lie that it is, and the contrasting biblical view of Christian women and what their calling is in Christian motherhood, to be followed by another four-part sermon series on the blessings of children and how that God's commands and requirements of us is to have large families, to marry early in large families, and go through a whole extensive doctrine of children. And I put in the article, has anybody ever heard of a sermon series like either one of those two? And I said, I've been in the Protestant realm. I got converted out of Catholicism in the Protestant realm since I was 18. So for 40-some years, I'm still waiting for a sermon like that. And so here's what happens, Pastor. tell me if this is right, that the young girls, the young women in our churches, whether they're black or white, doesn't matter, when they don't hear the Word of God on who they're supposed to be, on what their calling is before God, and what God requires of them as women and as future mothers, they end up defaulting to the culture. And when the default to the culture, they end up, at the end of their lives, all through their life, with a little mix of Christianity and a big blend of humanism from the culture, because the preachers are afraid to preach on those two subjects. Am I right or wrong?
You're right. You're exactly right. And, you see the evidence of that even more in this day and age, where if a minister is really beginning to get convicted by the Holy Spirit to preach the truth, to preach the Word, the first aspect that they run into is the roles of women. And, by the way, not just the young women, but even the older women have just enough of that mixture, even in them, to get kind of uncomfortable when such messages are preached. And it's something that I was a traveling minister for about altogether 31, 32 years, and now I've taken the pastorship of a church. And since taking the pastorship, I've been preaching some pretty strong and powerful messages. And I'm going to say this now to you two, so then you can get a good laugh. I've been told by women, we're praying for you to have a pastor's heart. And you know what they mean by that? We're praying that you will tone down the strength of the Word.
Gentlemen, I can hear our ads coming on our commercial break. If you can hold that thought, we'll pick it up on the other side.
Okay. Sure. All right.
Thank you so much for listening to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Dan will be back shortly. In the meantime, Dan wanted me to speak to you about connecting your own dots when it comes to being prepared for any situation. As we have all observed in the news, natural disasters are occurring at a record pace across the United States and the world. Hurricanes and floods, earthquakes, and wildfires burning out of control. You could potentially have a bullseye on your own town or country. For that reason, Dan has partnered with Patriot Prepared to bring you a full line of products to provide the insurance that you need for any unexpected disaster. Whether it's our full line of high-quality, freeze-dried, storable food, our own industry-leading water filtration products, you can find it all by visiting patriotprepared.com/dots. It makes good sense to be prepared. That's patriotprepared.com/dots.
Whew, nice shooting. Hey, that's a sweet AK-47 chest rig. Is that multicam?
Yep, got it from StrikeHardGear.com.
Strike what?
StrikeHardGear.com.
Set your sights on StrikeHardGear.com. Tough, tactical gear for your Soviet-style weapon that's made in the USA. Affordable, plus a no-questions-asked 30-day money-back guarantee and lifetime replacement warranty. StrikeHardGear.com. Go ahead, pull the trigger.
Now you can feel that squeaky clean sensation like none other with Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash. Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash is a unique natural formula not found in any other oral care products. With a gentle combination of zinc, folic acid, myrrh, and clove oil, Vitamer effectively whitens teeth, removes plaque, and freshens breath, and it does it naturally without any harmful chemicals. Visit us online at Vitamer.com. That's VITAMYR.com. Or call us today to place your order at 1-888-558-8482. That's 1-888-558-8482. Keep your teeth and gums healthy with Vitamer toothpaste and mouthwash. Vitamer, nature's answer to healthy teeth and gums. And remember, it's all completely natural. Available at participating health food stores nationwide.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls the string.
Welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guests are Tom Ertl and Reverend Matthew Cummings. And Matthew, you were speaking as we went into the break about the effect of the pulpit and a strong message, and how we've got to be willing to stand up for what's right if we are to truly say that we're Christians and that we believe in the Bible. We have to stand up and be counted. Go ahead and continue with your thoughts, and then we'll weigh in with Tom.
Just quickly that I've recognized just on what Tom was just commenting. I'm actually connecting the dots myself, that every single time there's a strong message, if there's anything in regard to the roles of men and women, biblically speaking, that if it's considered too strong, that there's a move to intimidate through complaints. And I've had to just because of teaching and preaching as a visiting minister first, and speaking in regard to against Obama for 8 years, and getting flack in black churches and elsewhere. I've had to learn that after a while, no matter what the complaint is, I must be able to answer to God, I've done what you've asked. Most pastors are not looking at that. They're looking at, how can I please my congregation, and not how can I please my Lord and Savior Jesus. So there's coming a real conviction, I believe, to American pastors and ministers to get back to the Word. And Tom, I was thinking quickly as you were talking in regard to those two messages. Mm-hmm. It's in the first message about feminism that by the end of that first message, phone calls would have come in to the leadership.
Yeah, I can understand.
And the heat would have been on. And by the second message, if his own wife isn't strong, she's having people approach her and telling her, you need to take your husband to tone that down. So, those are the kinds of things that I believe God's trying to basically toughen his church up and toughen the pastors up and get them back to wisdom, but also zeal. In other words, passion for the Word, passion for society, Mm-hmm. Because, I have passion for God's Word, and I have passion.
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, before you get the calls to the elders, what I would recommend is get your two biggest guys at the back of the church to hold the doors so people don't leave early when you start doing the sermon. I think, I tell me what you think of this, but I tell pastors, when I get a chance to talk to them sometime, I said, you preach the difficult things, but you preach what people need, and more so than that, you mentioned it earlier, you have a responsibility to God in your calling as a pastor to preach the whole counsel of God, even if it's difficult. And I tell them, you're going to lose people. There's going to be people, because they've been affected by the culture, that are going to leave. But then when the word gets out in the community that you are very pro-family, you've been teaching on Christian womanhood, teaching on bambinos, having babies, large families, all of a sudden there's a huge element in that town that's going to hear about this and say, wow, my pastor would never preach this. And you're going to end up, over time, probably with a bigger church of more committed people. Don't you think that might happen?
Amen.
Mm-hmm. Guys, you're absolutely right on the money with that. I've seen that we saw it with the presidency. We saw that with the election of President Trump. The fact is that our culture, our country, has been allowed to atrophy because of people that are so afraid to offend somebody, and we've gotten to the point where we've almost lost our country as a result of that. And I think, what we're doing here is connecting dots, because all these things play together. And it's time that people realize that if you don't stand up, as the old country song says, if you won't stand for something, you'll stand for anything. And, that's exactly where we're at as a country and as a culture. And if we truly believe that the Bible is the Word of God and the teachings that are in that Bible, we have to understand that we have to be accountable. We have to stand up and be counted, or we're not going to be His chosen few.
That's it.
Okay, guys, I didn't mean to dominate that conversation with that, but we've been talking about the isms, and I'm going to throw another one in. We've got a new one now, and it's come as a result of UN Agenda 21 and some of these other things, and that's environmentalism. And they literally are trying to create a new religion that is based on the environment and Gaia, the physical world, being a representation of God and not man. And all I can say is that they just keep adding problems to this whole mix, and now we're facing a whole new thing. What do you think about that?
Matt, I'll let you answer that one.
Oh, me? Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I'm not environmental expert. I don't know much about it.
We followed the UN Agenda 21. Debbie Boscalupi is one of the real experts on that. I guess in many ways I am too. But one of the things with Agenda 21 is to eliminate Christianity and traditional religion and replace it with a worship of the earth. It's just flat paganism, as far as I can tell. And it's been pretty successful. You take a look at how many young people believe this stuff.
Yeah. Well, in regard to Agenda 21, the other part that is very disturbing is why also the church and God-fearing people and just people of common sense have not really understood how many mayors in our great republic have submitted their cities to under Agenda 21, the UN institution of that. How many city councils don't even realize that they're under that mandate, and that the the removal and the dumbing down of the influence of the church. Also, part of that, which, Dan, you know, and Tom, you may have heard of, is the idea of removing people off the land. And here comes that other ism, getting them back to rack 'em and stack 'em. You know, making sure that you don't own your own land, that the land goes back to what they call Mother Nature. And then the other part of that is to make sure that cars, and there's so much in that people, you know, they hear it and they get overwhelmed, and that's the first sign that we need to have people such as yourself, Tom, and others, not just get educated, but as teachers, educate the people, educate the church, educate common sense people all over about that. Because, and then I'll just say this, and I'll be quiet for a minute. From 90 to 92, I was under a church in Portland, Oregon, and under a church called Portland Temple. And my pastors were up in their years, what they're called, you know, crazy Pentecostals, I'll just say that. And in a nutshell, as things were going on with the homosexual movement, the other movement that grew and exploded out of that time was the environmental movement. You know, it moved in another level in America. And people lost jobs, as you guys know, all over the Pacific Northwest because of the spotted owl. That was just a trumped-up emergency. You know, loggers, whole towns were destroyed because of the spotted owl. And just so, you know, having been allowed to be in the Pacific Northwest back then and watching it and see where it's gone now, my head just shakes. But even more why it shakes is because pastors, to me, as a minister, the church ministers didn't know what to do with it because they heard the idea of being a steward of the earth, which is what we're called to be, but did not understand that what was really being said was, you as God-fearing people have blown it as good stewards. The state will now take over. Are you there?
Yep, we're here. Yep. No, you're absolutely on the money with that. And ICLEI, if Tom's not aware of this, but ICLEI is the organization that promotes UN Agenda 21 programs at a government level. ICLEI has over 550 municipalities and local governments as members of their program, and it's a direct support of UN Agenda 21 and environmentalism. And you know, like I say, it's just another ism that they've added to the pile, and it is very definitely anti-Christian. It is very strongly Marxist, socialist, very progressive program, and it's just one more of the complexities, and there's so many of them. And Tom, you're on with the feminism, because that is a huge, absolutely huge part of this. And with feminism, they've managed to get an awful lot of these other programs involved as well.
Hey, Dan, if I could chirp in a little off of what the pastor and you just said. By the way, we have a mutual friend, Jim Carlson from Kansas. I think he was on your show.
Oh, yes. Jim's been on our radio show. Yep.
Yeah, and Jim's really one of the leaders in the country for land rights and for obviously less regulation in that whole realm. So what we have in one of your other isms is this illegal takings, the takings of land from people by the government. And this is all tied again to the family. All these isms are all tied, and you can bring it back to the family. You can't, when you start separating families from the land, you start destroying families. So it's key, and you know, it's not only takings, but You should see the property tax some of my clients have to pay on their homes. It is unbelievable. It's like a confiscation of wealth. They wake up every first of the month and they're paying $1,500 a month, basically, or a lot of them even more, to the local government for property tax, which is really Marxian and it's really illegal. So all this stuff is really tied into the Christian order, which supports the family.
Agree. Yeah, it is all tied together, and I guess that's why we call this connecting the dots, because every time we get a guest on, like you two gentlemen, we start to realize just exactly how tied together the whole thing is, and all these different programs are designed to do one thing. They're designed to destroy the Christian church, and they're designed to destroy the United States of America as a constitutional republic, one nation under God. And that is what the whole thing is all about, because the socialists, the communists, the Marxists decided a long time ago that if we can get rid of the United States of America and we can destroy Christianity, we can control the whole thing. And they use everything in their power to be able to try to pull all those programs together. I'm just grateful that there's people out there like yourself and like some of our other guests that have been on our show that are willing to stand up and speak out about this. Matthew, tell us a little bit about some of the programs that you were involved in. You had a kind of an epiphany in 2008 because you saw the country falling apart. And I don't know if that's the right term to use, but you were in Europe at the time, and you had a calling, and you literally were told by God that it was time to come back home and to stand up for the United States of America. Would you tell our listeners a little about that?
Sure. I had Confessions of a Minister, Tom. I was looking almost to build my own name for a minute, and God had opened up Europe and was ministering in England and France and Switzerland, and things were going, as what might say, quite well. But we were in, of course, a presidential election year, and Barack Hussein Obama had come over to Europe and had been basically winning the hearts of all the socialist, social democratic countries over there. I was in Europe during that time. It was maddening, but still, wanted to continue with ministry and didn't think much about it. I had been a conservative, been voting Republican in conservative ways for quite a long time, but didn't want to be out in the open, as one might say, as a black man. And basically, to make a long story short, as I was preaching on a Sunday, it was my third sermon in a third church during the time of ministry time, and really felt that there was a tug on my heart from God, and a conversation started where literally God said, America is going as France. And France has been atheist for, 90-some years? And the Lord said, America is going that way. And basically the Lord said, I need you to shut this ministry down and go home, because Barack Obama is going to win. And the Holy Spirit said, he's not of me. And that I want you to go home. I want you to be outspoken. I want you to get out there and start this preaching against Obama. Be open about being a Republican. Well, a black person being a Republican out in the open, I was going to take heat for that. But I said, okay. And in a nutshell, sense that the Lord, when he said shut it down, he meant right then and there. So I finished that sermon and called my pastor at the time, which was in Nebraska, and basically felt that the Lord had said, to come home, and that God had said that I was not to be quiet anymore in my, not just my faith, because I've never been quiet about my faith, but to be involved and even outspoken about what's going on in the political, and that Christians need not to be quiet, conservatives need not to be quiet, that the time to raise your voice was now. And so I did eventually shut it down and basically came back to America, came back to Nebraska, got involved. Republican Party, of course, we had John McCain as our candidate. I went ahead on and helped the Republican Party in Lancaster County as far as making sure that his name got out. I had told my pastor Barack was going to win. My pastor thought Hillary was going to win. So when Barack won, my pastor knew that I had heard from the Lord. And then after that, let's just say the 8 years was 8 years of swimming upstream.
Yeah.
And speaking against tyranny, speaking against socialism, communism, speaking against racism, reverse racism, because although our former president was part black, part white, he truly was emulating everything which sounded more what I call the black Muslims with Louis Farrakhan. I visited with black ministers that I knew who had big congregations, and I watched each one just yield under Barack's way of thinking. And let's just say God taught me a very interesting lesson during that time.
Yeah.
When you preach...
gentlemen, we've got to move into a break here, but let's pick this up on the other side of the break, and this is a terrific discussion. I hope our listeners are really getting good value out of this discussion. Thank you.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You don't really understand sometimes what a terrible burden it is to know some of the things that I know. And try to wake people up and impart this knowledge to them. And find out that they just have walls built in front of them. They want to be slaves.
Now, I risk sounding like a conspiracy theorist, but it's no longer a theory. What I'm about to say is fact. The secret organizations of the world power elite are no longer secret. They have planned and are now leading us into a one-world communist government.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots. Today I have Tom Ertl and Reverend Matthew Cummings on the show. I want to remind our listeners, please support the Micro Effect Radio Network. We have a program that we're working on for satellite uplink, and we need your support to make that happen. So please get online and donate some money and help us to get that satellite uplink going, because literally with that uplink we can extend our listenership into the many millions of people all over North America. So please do that, and also please get on and listen to our other guests, our other hosts, I should say, on the radio here. We've got Jeff Bennett coming up with Life, Liberty, and all that jazz right after my program. And tomorrow we've got Radioactive Wednesday with Debbie Boscalupi, and her guests are an 8th grader who have the guts to stand up in class and went through quite a bit of problems with his teachers because of that. He stood up and said that introduction to wolves was not a good thing. He's from a ranching family, and he was ostracized for that. Also, Jim Beers, who is a gentleman who was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for many years, retired from that agency, and was the whistleblower that exposed that $50 million had been used from the Pittman-Robertson Fund to fund the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone Park. And they weren't just ordinary wolves, they were Canadian gray wolves, which were much larger and much more aggressive than the timber wolves that had actually been there. So it'll be an interesting discussion. That'll be tomorrow morning from 8 till 10 Pacific time. So please join Debbie with that show. She'll inform and educate you folks. Okay, let's get back to the discussion. And Tom, I want to give you a really good chance to weigh in on not only on the lack of birth rate because of feminism in the United States, but the impact that is having right now because of Islam and some other religions that promote high birth rate, and how we're losing the cultural war as a result of that.
Well, good questions there. A couple of them you had. Interesting, Islam. I put it in the article. I subtitled it in the section there in the middle of the article was Islam's secret weapon. And we all seen the pictures of these Islamic clerics holding up little babies and declaring, "We will conquer you." And they're absolutely correct. If you read history, it's interesting. I'm a big Will Durant reader. I would advise your readers to get his whole series. You can get it pretty cheap. History of Civilization, 11 volumes. And when you read through it, and you read through the ancient civilizations, I just read recently he had some tremendous accounts on the kingdom of Persia. And he said Persia's greatness was their dedication to their military strength and their dedication to fertility. The dedication to have for womanhood, for moms, and to have large families. And that's where they became a world empire. And they couldn't have done it with either one. Obviously, in that kind of era, you had to protect yourself militarily. And I'm reading the other book I recommend your audience to get is Pat Buchanan's Death of the West. I think you've heard of that, 2002 book. And here's what's interesting. He talks about history, and he says basically the decline of the Greek and Roman Empire was also a decline in the birth rate. And he went into details on Greece and what happened there with the great empire, the Greek Empire, and then also with the Roman Empire. Now, what's interesting, here's the positive spin on what happened with the Roman Empire, is that as the Christian church grew, and it's really what we're talking about here on this radio show. Okay, you got feminism, which was a worldwide Western phenomenon. Okay, so here's the question. What's the church's response? What's the church's answer? And obviously, the quickest answer is just do the opposite. Whatever the feminist says, just do the opposite. So they want women to be free. They want women to enjoy themselves sexually. So we believe in abstinence till marriage. We don't believe in sex outside of marriage. And they don't like to have children. They want to abort them. So we have many of them. So historically, and I've heard this before from histories I've read, where in the Roman Empire, as the paganism increased within the population, they were having less and less children. They were aborting their children. A common practice was, and I remember reading this years ago, was for the Roman pagans to leave that unwanted baby under the bridges in Rome, and it was a common practice for the Christians to pick up the babies and to raise them for Christ. So their growth rate was exponential beyond their birth rate. And you see a positive thing of many of these Christian families. I've got a good friend in North Augusta, and I lose track of these kids. I think he's had 8. His wife's had 8 or 9 kids. I don't know if she could have any more, so they just adopted 2 more. And so you see these, even though they're not getting it from the pulpit, these Christian women see their role, understand it, have a love for children, and they're even not only they're having them, but they're adopting them. So you see the absolute critical element of big families, of high birth rates, is needed to continue a culture. Now, let me just go over a couple more things, and I'll be quiet. What's interesting, I also put in the article actually, let me go one thing. You mentioned Islam. I have a friend in Switzerland who worked at the post office there in Lausanne, and he asked the Islamic fellow worker, he said, why do you Mohammedans have so many children? And his immediate answer was, because we believe in God. And doggone it, they stole that from us. It should be the covenant people of God, the Christians that say that. We have large families because we believe in God. And so with all the negativity about, the birth rates that we discussed earlier in the program, we're seeing a Christian renewal in the old Soviet Union called the Russian Federation. We're seeing it in some of the Eastern Bloc countries, where it's fascinating to see how God providentially moves, because Bolshevikism took over Russia and destroyed it for 70 years. 40, 50, 60 million white Russians dead after the Bolsheviks got done. So that was since 1917, since 1945, 48, 54, many of the Eastern Bloc Balkan countries were taken over by the Soviet Union. And so it's almost like God, I put this in the article, God pushed the pause button on those Eastern Bloc countries and the old Russia, and they were not susceptible to religious liberalism, the apostasy that came into the Western Church. They were not subject to feminism and all the isms that we've got to deal with. That's a huge battle in America and in Western Europe. And then the Soviet Union ended in the late 80s, and then God pushes the play button. So they didn't have to go through any of that. And so now you see a vibrant renewal of Trinitarian Christianity in the Russian Orthodox Church. I put in the article that this great movement of the church in Russia and the government working together to advance Christianity, because the government knows that the foundation of Russian culture is in the church. They know it. They're building, I also put in the article that they're building, with the help of the government, huge amount of churches in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and some of the other cities, in order for the people not to be able to walk to church like the old days, like we used to have in America years ago. And somebody told me, who's familiar with Russian culture, said, Tom, the reason they're building these churches is because the government knows in Russia that when the people fall under Christian instruction, biblical instruction, they're less likely to abort their children, and they're more likely to marry early and have large families. So they have a biblical motive in all of what they're doing. So it's and let me just say one more thing, and I'll be quiet. I don't know if you both heard Megyn Kelly's interview with President Putin in Russia, and it was just hysterical. It was just he just put her in her place, which is a delight to see. It's better than entertainment. And he would point to his ear during the interview and said, "You're not listening to me," and he kept having to repeat things. Well, she asked him this. She said, President Putin, what do you think some of your great accomplishments in you as in your position in government? So he talked about economic things, but then he said this. He says, we've been able to reduce the infant mortality rate in Russia, and we have prepared in our, I'm quoting him now, we have prepared and are implementing a large-scale program of supporting mothers and children. Our life expectancy is growing at a huge rate. So he talked about in the 90s, when Yeltsin took over and the oligarchs had pillaged Russia after the end of the Soviet Union, that there was despondency, massive drunkenness in Russia, huge abortion rates, some of the world leaders in the Western world in abortion. And all of this is being reversed as the church grows. Let me just give you one more quote. Same thing is going on in Hungary. Viktor Orban, in his State of the Union speech this year in Hungary on February 19th, let me quote you this. And the listener needs to imagine an American president saying something like this. Quote, Viktor Orban, I believe that families form the unifying backbone of the entire country. I believe that everyone who commits to having children should be given all the support possible, and I believe that mothers must be respected and honored. How about that from a head of state?
Yeah.
So the politicians know that in order for them to continue Russian and Hungarian culture, it's got to be religious, and we've got to honor and protect motherhood like we used to in the old Western world.
Mm-hmm. Yep, couldn't agree with you more, Tom. That's exactly right. And these are countries that have lived under communism for a very long time. And like you said, in Russia, their population had declined precipitously. And, you know, they're a huge country geographically, but their population was hovering just a little over 100 million people. And, they saw that as being a problem, and obviously it is a problem. And I think we need to recognize as Western cultures that that's a problem for us as well. And having a culture that's based on a biblical Christian understanding that our founding fathers were religious men. Not all of them, but virtually all of them had some foundation in the church, and that our system of government, our freedoms, was based on the principle of common law and natural law under nature's God. And that system, even though a lot of our detractors try to say that that isn't the case, Christianity was at the very center of our founding as a nation. And we need to go back to those principles because, in fact, what's happening right now is that we're losing our focus. And we are facing the annihilation as a modern Christian free society. Matthew, weigh in on that.
Well, I just say amen. That, to recognize that this is a scenario that was formulated by communism, socialism, all the isms that are trying to attack. We need to not just hear what was just said by Brother Tom and by you, but then we need some strong conviction to know how to fight back in regard to that, and to reinstitute the idea that family comes first, that motherhood is the most important, one of the most important aspects of a Western society, and that for our nation right now, that all of the elites and the different groups that are looking to see this republic be destroyed, that they not just be called out, but that people are not just educated, but that they take a final stand that's needed, morally, with faith, financially, politically, and quite frankly, which is what's, in my opinion, it's time to take back the culture.
Yep, you're right on.
It sounds kind of radical,
Amen.
But, I am very much a believer that if you say you believe something, then it needs to be worth that it could cost you. And that's where I've come to. So.
Dan, if I could add that.
Gentlemen, I'd have to add this. I think if there was ever a time to be radical, it's right now, because we are losing our country. And if we don't stand up and be a little bit radical, I think the other side's been radical forever. They've just been subtle in the way they're doing it. And it's time for us as Christians and as patriots to stand up and say no more.
Amen. If I could add on Matt's statement when he said it's time to take back the culture, that is the word for the hour. Now, notice he didn't say it's time to take back the Republican Party. Now, I believe in that, in the latter thing, and I believe in we Christians need to be involved in the political sphere of civil government. But as I said earlier in the program, civil government is always a limited role as outlined in the Bible. And culture always trumps politics. The issue we have today is, what was it, in the 90s, Paul Weyrich, great Christian leader, Catholic man, member of Council on National Policy, he was a leader in the whole conservative political realm, and he was frustrated, and he brought this out in one of his newsletters, that we win all these elections and we're losing the culture. So the whole educational system basically is run by our enemies. They own the media, the newspapers. They're starting to influence the seminaries, which are going liberal. All the key elements are all run by our enemies, and we hole ourselves up in our churches, and we get involved with politics, thinking politics is going to change things, and it's not, and it's limited. So I always go back to de Tocqueville. His great work published in 1832, when he took 9 months, he went through the United States, and he did a review on American life. And he said this, but he said a lot of things. But he said one thing. He said, America is great because America is good. Then he followed up, basically, I could paraphrase it, America is good because America is Christian. And he said this. He said there was basically no visible sign of government in America except on the local level. Holy cow, can you imagine a life like that? So he said, because the church, human societies, and church ministries took care of every human need. So you saw the church entering the whole realm of culture, realized they had a responsibility to care and care for people. And so all those, the numerous ministries were created for immigrants coming in. The Irish immigrants that came in ended up in Carolinas turned Presbyterian, turned Protestant, so many of them did because of the aid agencies that the Protestants had for them. So culture, we never we can, as many political articles as I write, I'm always reminded, Dan, of the fact that culture trumps politics. We can never forget it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. You're right. And if we don't focus on the important things, it's really irrelevant if we lose on the little things, because if we lose the big things, we've lost our country.
Yeah.
And we've lost our soul, frankly. Yeah. Matthew, I want to give you a few minutes to tell our listeners a little bit about your fellowship, your group, your church, and some of the things that you've been working on. And then I'd like to give Tom a few minutes to talk about his publishing company. So if you would, Matthew, just tell our listeners a little bit about what you're working on and your group and some of the things that you think are important for them to hear.
Sure. Just briefly, I'm head of a church called New Beginnings Fellowship in Kettle Falls, and in a nutshell, we've been doing what I call a season of outreach, and it entitles three things. One, that for too long at New Beginnings, the believers have heard the gospel and yet have not shared their faith and their love of Christ with others. So starting in June, on June the 9th, our church is doing its first out-and-out outreach, where the whole church we're inviting to go out and go door to door. I've been calling apartment complexes, calling those who are in charge of the land and just asking for permission to come. And we've gotten wonderful response on that. That's number one. Number two, we've been moving towards what I call the second part of outreach, reaching out to other brothers and in the Lord. And I'm just beginning to meet with pastors and ministers and beginning to discuss how we can see not just how I can see my church, but how other ministers and pastors can begin to work together to become of one heart and one mind, which won't happen overnight, but we know that we're going the right direction on that. And then last but not least, because I know time is moving, is that the third part of that outreach is to infect the culture. And that means that we're encouraging Christians to run for public office. And also, I've been speaking specifically on people who are creative, the arts, the sciences, to get involved in their local, different spheres of influence, and to speak Christ and to speak salt and light into that area. Because how can you see transformation or real change without each and every one of us doing our part? So in a nutshell, that's what's been going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you're right with that, Matthew, because you can't win the game if you're not in the game. And as Freedom Force International says, one of the basic premises, why fight City Hall when you can be City Hall? So it's important for our listeners to really want to be part of the solution and not just part of the whining and the belly aching people that complain about everything. It's time to get involved yourself and give of yourself because our society needs it. Tom, I want to give you a chance to talk about your publishing company and some of the things that you're involved in before we go to the end of the program. So please tell our listeners exactly what you've been involved with.
Yeah, as a lot of people are, a lot of Christians, I've got a vocation of home building and remodeling, and it's been fortunate because I was able to, off that, be able to do other things in the area of ministry on the side. One of it is I started in 2003, Zurich Publishing, and my attempt was to create and write and produce some books on the Swiss Reformation. I've read a lot about the Protestant Reformation, especially the Swiss. I had more interest in that than the German Reformation. And so I went to Switzerland to meet people in 2004, get some ideas, take pictures, and see what we could do. So at the end of the trip, I met pastor, theologian, at his bookstore in Lausanne, Jean-Marc Vertu, and great man. And he showed me. I showed him what I was going to do. Then he said, "Listen, all that's good, but if you really want to do something really effective, you need to reprint and translate the works of Pierre Viret and Pierre Courtial." Viret was John Calvin's closest associate. He and Viret and Farel and Fromeau brought the Reformation to Geneva, which was a critical city in 1536. So I was familiar with Viret, and John Mark showed me some of his works, and so I kind of commissioned me to go ahead and do that. So we've put together, and I've had somebody do some translation works, somebody close to me here in the Tallahassee area on Pierre Viret. So we're able to get 4 books out so far. We're working on others. I'd like to, by the time I'm done, translate maybe 20 of his works. He did 55 books. So we're having to translate it from 16th century French into modern English, which is a little bit of a task. The other one I just sent you was Pierre Courtial's The New Day of Small Beginnings. And this is probably the most important thing I'll ever do in my life, is to be able to put this book out. It's been a 10-year project. It's a difficult translation work, and had a very competent pastor translate it from French into English. And it's a covenantal view of church history with Courtial at the end of the book gives the church some hope and gives the church tools in our battle against humanism. So it's not a theological book just for knowledge, it gives the church tools. So your listeners can just pull that up, and if they want to order it, they can